Now, more of Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute, the only show directly addressing the problems and solutions for Illinois. Now, from AM 560, here's Dan Proft.
Dan Proft back with Hilary Gowins from the Illinois Policy Institute, managing editor there. And we're talking to Fred Long, the Vice President of Development and Government Affairs at UCAN, and Brian Walker, who is a UCAN board member. And again, UCAN, a Chicago-based nonprofit that serves thousands of at-risk youth in the city of Chicago. And Brian, you're a successful PR executive. You run your own company, entrepreneur. What was it that prompted you to get involved with UCAN and try and facilitate some of the work that Fred is doing on a daily basis?
Great question. Well, they actually came to me for my professional services first. That's how I met them. And I was stunned by the fact that you had an organization that had been around since before the Great Chicago Fire, but really nobody had heard of. So they hired me to help them with some of their brand and marketing strategy, get a better sense of how they could inform and educate people like myself, people like you, people like Hilary that maybe don't know who they are, but could help them in different ways and open up new avenues for them. So I did some work with them for a couple of years, and then after that they asked me to sit on the board. And I'll never forget the first time that I actually was out at UCAN. I actually met Fred at a program called Project Visible Man, which is where they work with at-risk young men who don't have a male presence in the home, which I later found out that the state disincentivizes households for not having that male in the home. But it was an issue where they were trying to make a difference and have meaningful program and a constant presence to keep these kids out of trouble. And what was really fascinating to me is, like Fred, we both have young children. I only live a few miles from North Lawndale, but it might as well be a different world. Right. And I think too many people look at what happens there as that's not my problem. But as I think we're seeing through some of the numbers and through some of the violence that literally just happened this week, it's everyone's problem.
Well, so let's talk about the numbers a little bit. We mentioned black unemployment, worst in the nation in Illinois. Chicago, obviously, even more pronounced than the state in general. We've got murders up 65% in the city of Chicago year over year. Shootings up 78%. CPS is, Chicago Public School System, is bankrupt financially, morally, and in every other way. And so how do we get out of this vicious cycle of failed civic institutions and, to your point, Brian, disintegrating family structures? It seems like we're kind of trying to treat all of the wounds, but we're not maybe doing as much as we could on the prevention side so people don't get wounded in the first place. And I wonder how UCAN approaches these problems. I know you can't, you don't have a panacea for all the world's ills, but more work on the prevention side to steer people away from some of these destructive choices.
Right. That's one of the things that our CEO, Tom Vandenberg, has been working on for quite some time now, really changing the ideology around shifting those funds on the back end to the front end. Now, we see it on the back end in the Department of Corrections. We see it, in special education, the cost of that. And so we've really put together some business principles around affordability of transitioning that funding mechanism towards the prevention work. Now, when we decided to move into North Lawndale, it's $40 million, nice, big, beautiful campus. But, what good is it if we're not kind of helping the community in terms of what the ills are in that community specifically? So one of the things we said, part of this capital campaign that we wanted to construct this facility is, yes, we want to construct it so that we can have a program service center to kind of provide services. But then we also added another $7.2 million to that price tag to start to kind of look at how do we move from the end game to the prevention side. So we're doing a lot of violence prevention work in the North Lawndale community to really get young people prior to they get into some of these dire situations where, guns are involved, drugs are involved. So even our service population for the community start to kind of dwindle towards an earlier age.
Are some of those programs, are you in the schools?
We're in schools. We have contracts through Chicago Public Schools and other entities, and we're funded some with private. There's some private funding sources and mechanisms that we're using to go into schools and work with young people in the schools along with the faculty in the schools so that they can have an understanding of how we understand trauma from a clinical perspective. you see a young person acting out in school, the first thing teachers and educators and academia does is say that that's a social issue that my education or expertise isn't well versed in. So what do? We send them to the principal's office. And if you look at explosions, they were very high probably about 5 or 10 years ago. Chicago Public Schools understood that that's not the way to do it, to kind of get kids where they need to be. So we really have to look at some of the social emotional learning aspects of academia.
So you're talking about prevention. What sort of tools are you arming kids with? You talked about jobs. Maybe expand on some of the other programs that you offer.
Yeah, so we offer a lot of male mentoring programs for young men of color specifically, and also young women of color. And Brian alluded to one of them, Project Visible Man, because we used to have funding at the federal level to really work in schools and do a lot of the after the fact service. But one of the things we're seeing is that what we're seeing in the schools is that a lot of young ladies would participate, and the young boys and young men in those situations were just totally disengaged. So we had to take a step back and understand we have to service that population in a very unique way, in a very different and real way. And so we put together programs that would address some of those symptoms that we talked about specifically with African American men and boys. And that really kind of took off for us.
So that's one program that is showing signs of success and perhaps should be scaled.
Correct.
In the social service provider space, the wraparound services space, there's a lot of players. What are some things that you've seen in terms of programs, best intentions, concede the point, but programs where there's been a lot of money and a lot of focus and a lot of political support, but not much in terms of the way of results? Where are we doing things we shouldn't be doing and redirecting resources? Divest over here, this isn't working. Invest over here, like in Project Visible Man, things that are working.
Yeah, right now, if we look at it from a funding mechanism, a lot of foundations, private individuals, and the state as well are really driving towards what they call budgeting for results and all of these different systems to really look at evaluation tools to see what's working. 10, 20 years ago, funding was rampant, of social services, and now it's a little bit more dire, and you have to really kind of prove yourself in this, if you will. And so all of UCAN's programs now really operate under the sense if it doesn't make fiscal sense, then it can be the best intentions in the world, we would not go forward in those endeavors. So that we make sure that, what we're doing is something that is very meaningful, but then also it makes business sense. And that's really how we've been able to sustain ourselves for a period of time.
So, Fred, you were talking about community earlier. I want to get back to talking about the community because, like you said, UCAN is in North Lawndale, actually really close to the original Sears Tower.
Correct.
And you're sort of in this vast wasteland of what used to be this manufacturing hub where people who may be now partaking of your services used to be able to get jobs. So talk about the community. What is the community suffering from, and how are you trying to help them?
I don't even think I'll do it a good job just giving my personal perspective. I think there's an array of things that happen to that community specifically that results in what we see in that community today. I.e. the Sears Roebuck Company, was this big manufacturing, anybody in here shopped at the old Sears catalog, back in the days. So that was the hub of Chicago, if you will, in terms of manufacturing jobs. 20,000 people came to that neighborhood, North Lawndale, every day and worked there before they took the Sears Tower from there and took it downtown. So when that happened, all of those jobs left as well. And so when you don't have that, then you kind of tie into when Martin Luther King walked those streets back in the 60s, and there was they burned a lot of that area down, for protests and all of that stuff. And so ever since some of those things, there's some major sea changes that happened that really shows its face today. And one of the things why we decided to move there is that we looked at who do we serve? We're currently located up in the northwest part of Chicago, near Gordon Tech and Lane Tech High School, right off Addison, near the Cubs, a little west of the Wrigley Field. And if we look at that community where we were being housed and providing services, it didn't reflect who we were serving.
Yeah, all those frat kids live out there.
Yeah,
they don't need the services as much.
Yeah, exactly. It didn't reflect. And, So we decided, and we got a geo map through the Department of Children and Family Service to look at where do most of the hotline calls come from for any acts of an abuse and neglect. And once we looked at this map, we seen a lot of the calls came from the North Lawndale community or around it. And so we decided, because what the state does, in a sense, the Department of Corrections, they take people out into suburban, rural areas. There's an economic, as we should be familiar with, there's an economic incentive for having these facilities in certain rural areas. There's jobs and all these things attached to it. So the theory was, if something has negatively happened, take people out of their communities and disenfranchise them from their families. We want to do the total opposite. So we decided, look, we're going to move to where we believe these issues are happening. Very bold, very innovative as well.
And Brian, speaking of the state and state finances, the backlog of bills, social service providers cutting budgets, cutting staff, some closing their doors, what's UCAN's kind of approach to dealing with the new financial reality in Illinois and trying to perhaps make up through private funding what you're not going to be able to anticipate from the state anymore?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with better informing people of who UCAN is. As I mentioned earlier, it's shocking how nobody really knows who they are, yet they've been around for so long. And really figuring out ways to do a better job of communicating that and going after private sector dollars, foundation dollars. I think they recognize that UCAN is competing for the same share of wallet as a lot of other, not just social service organizations in Chicago, but a number of philanthropic causes as well. And I think having been in North Lawndale several times now, and actually stood atop the old Sears Tower looking down to the new one, or the Willis Tower, if you will, it's fascinating to me to think about all the employees at UCAN that are saying, we'll move into this horrible neighborhood because we all need to take a stand. And I think trying to build off of that and make other people understand that if we don't fix the problems in North Lawndale and other parts of the city, if we don't give opportunity, if we don't reallocate some of our resources, it will be a cancer, and it will grow and it will grow and it will grow. So one of the things that I'm passionate about being on the board is raising awareness to UCAN and getting more people involved that can write big checks.
He's Brian Walker, board member at UCAN. Fred Long, Vice President of Government Affairs at UCAN. Brian, Fred, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
For having us.